Hey there guys, welcome to the next video here on the channel. This is going to be a mini tutorial on how to cut duct tape. I get a lot of requests on exactly how to cut duct tape the best way possible. So I'm going to be going over a whole bunch of different tips, tricks, and methods in this video to really help you guys figure out a way to cut the tape and then kind of master it for your own individual way of doing it. So let's get started here on the mini tutorial. So to start off this video, we really have to go with the most basic way of cutting tape, and that's actually not even really cutting it, but ripping it right off the roll. So technically, all you really need to do or to work with duct tape at its most basic level is a roll of tape and both of your hands. So basically, if you're ripping tape, you're really only probably going to be ripping tape if you have no hobby knife, no cutting mat, or no pair of scissors or anything like that. But typically what you do is you kind of hold it on one side and then just kind of rip with the other side. The only problem with ripping the tape is, number one, you usually don't get a very clean edge, as you can see, and it usually stretches out the tape a little bit. It didn't do it too well right there, but that's actually a little bit better than it usually looks like. And you can only really do squares. You can't really do shapes or triangles. You definitely can't work on like a whole bunch of really cool designs with just ripping tape. But it is a fairly effective method if you have literally nothing else, like no hobby knife, no cutting mat, no pair of scissors or anything like that. You can just use your pair of hands to just rip the tape, and you'll have some fairly clean cuts if you get it, down to a science, if you do it enough. It really does mess with your hands after a while though, so that's one of the major things about ripping tape. Your hands do get very tired and very kind of raw from ripping the tape. From there, we're going to go to our second method, and using a pair of scissors is probably the most obvious method for cutting tape. It's probably what a lot of you guys really started off with when you're working on duct tape, or if you're just starting off, you probably went to your pair of scissors first to use it to cut the tape. There are a few pairs of scissors on the market that are specifically non-stick scissors that are used for cutting adhesives. I typically use the ones by Westcott, which you see on the channel a lot, and the best part about using non-stick scissors is that usually when you cut it, it cuts right through the tape and it doesn't get the blades all gunked up after a while. If you do use a pair of normal scissors like these on my right here are fairly normal, and these still do cut through the tape really nicely, but after a while they definitely get all gunked up and kind of dull because the tape really wears on the blades, and then eventually it's nearly impossible to cut the tape. So if you do use your pair of scissors, if you're not going to go the hobby knife route and the cutting mat, try to get a non-stick pair of scissors. Westcott makes them. There are also a few other companies, but you definitely want to try to go with something other than a regular pair of scissors, because they're just going to get gunked up, they're going to get dull, and then you're probably just going to have to use them for paper, and then you're going to have to buy another pair. So scissors aren't exactly the best method, but they are a viable way of doing it if you're not going to go with the hobby knife and the cutting mat, which I'll be doing next. Alright, so now we move on to the hobby knife and the cutting mat. Now these are pretty much hailed as the universal two things for cutting all kinds of duct tape in millions of different ways. This is where the possibilities really open up. So say I have my normal piece of duct tape. If you have your cutting mat, of course, you can line it up on the bars and the graph that you kind of have on the cutting mat, which is always helpful. And then, of course, using your hobby knife, you can just cut, of course, any way you want it to be. Now the issue here, or I guess the great advantages to doing this are the blades don't typically get gunked up. You're typically using just about that part of the blade. It's just from my fingernail up, and then that's pretty much the only part that gets dull and really gets all gunked up, and it's really easy to just wipe it right off as long as you're careful. The great part about using the cutting mat is that if it does have all these cool measurements on it, it's really easy to measure where you want to cut the tape and then go from there. So I'm going to give you guys a few tips when you're working with your hobby knife and your cutting mat, as well as cutting it straight and cutting it in exactly the way you want it to. Alright, so cutting on a straight line, this is kind of the exact request that I get a lot in private messages and just on the channel in general. Now, one of the easiest ways, the first tip you really need to know about, is that to try to cut on the lines of your cutting mat. If it has these grid lines on it, you definitely want to work with those. But to practice cutting straight, you want to get a good comfortable grip with your hobby knife. You want to make sure that it's lined up on your cutting mat, just in between the lines if you have, the lines on here. And then just practice cutting it straight here. Now when I'm cutting it up and down just like this, there's a few methods I'm using. What I'm doing is I'm watching the blade and going up and down, obviously, but I'm also looking at the last line to see if it's straight. So I'm going to rip these three pieces off that I just cut and go back to how we had it just a second ago. So now if this is a straight line right here, then I can use that as my guideline to cutting a straight line through here, because if I look at the the way the cut is going, I can tell if this piece is either too thick or too narrow at the at any point of the strip, and then I know if I've been cutting it a little bit off and not exactly straight. But as you can tell, that's pretty good right there, so that's exactly what you're striving to go for. Now remember, this only works if the last piece you cut is pretty much perfectly straight. If you cut it like this, and then you work on to here, okay, well that's not exactly straight, so you don't really have a guideline to go from there. So you kind of want to just keep practicing this. Practice really makes perfect when you're cutting up and down and in straight lines. You just want to take a few scrap pieces, or if you want to dedicate, a giant strip of this, you can just concentrate, just practice this each day, just going up and down, and then that's really the easiest way to practice this and make sure that you get it straight every single time, or pretty much exactly close to it. From there, we're just doing up and down vertically. Now, horizontally is a totally different method. What you really want to do is, if you can work on it on if your project is set up a certain way, you can turn it like this and then cut it like this and then use it horizontally and then just turn it to the way you need it. But if you absolutely have to cut it horizontally, there's a few methods you can do. It's pretty much the exact same method. You want to look at the top and bottom for this one, and then you kind of just want to cut straight all the way down the line. There's a few other methods. I'm going to grab my ruler from my other workstation over here. Now you can use a ruler. Typically you want to use a hard ruler, like this is made out of stainless steel, also made by Westcott, by the way. And the greatest thing about this is it's not going to give, and I'm not going to be able to cut into this thing. I've used wooden rulers and plastic rulers in the past, and if you're using a sharp hobby knife blade, the hobby knife can cut right through the ruler, and then of course you're not exactly getting a straight cut. But if you have your ruler, just lined up, you can definitely allow you to have nice straight cuts, and this is really an easy way of kind of getting you into cutting it straight, because you can use your ruler to practice that until you get it perfect every time. So definitely the ruler is definitely a learning tool that you can use for that. Alright, now let's talk about cutting out circles or curved objects and broken blades. Now, if you've ever worked with hobby knives, I'm sure you've broken more than a few blades. It's really bound to happen no matter what you do. Now, let me show you exactly an illustration of what the broken blades look like. This is what a new blade looks like. This is actually what the Westcott ones look like. You've got a little bit of a forward slant, and then there's the sharp tip, and then it goes down like this. So that's exactly what it looks like there. Now, this is what a broken one looks like. Now, the interesting thing here is that after you break this piece off, which would be, this part would be broken off, there's usually a tip that's a little bit farther forward, and that part usually becomes the part you're cutting on if you don't notice that you've been cutting on it. So I'll draw this once again so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So all of a sudden this tip here becomes what you're cutting into your cutting mat with, and sometimes that's actually kind of sharp, especially if you just broke it right off. So you might not notice it at first. You can generally get kind of a few more hours worth of life out of the cutting, just out of the cutting surface. If you do break it off that way, you can definitely still use it, but you just definitely want to be careful because it's not the same blade that was on there. When you're cutting off circular objects or circular, just circles like this, that's typically how your knife blade will get cut and kind of broken off. So typically what you want to do is you want to put as least amount of pressure on the blade as possible. So if I was cutting this side, I want to kind of slant it, and then I want to kind of let up on it and then adjust. And then keep slanting, let up on it, and adjust again. You don't want to do the whole thing in one fell swoop, because that's one of the guaranteed ways of breaking the blade off, or the tip. So you want to just keep working on this, cut a little bit, and then readjust your hand, and then keep cutting. Make sure you're always applying the pressure straight down and not warping it or curving it. Sometimes you can see the blade kind of move, and that's generally okay as long as you're pushing straight down, but it just puts a lot of stress on that tiny little tip of the blade, and typically that's exactly how it, it really pops right off, and it usually ends up ingrained, like just kind of embedded in your cutting mat, and then of course you have to fish that out eventually. Alright, so that's pretty much going to wrap up this video on just all about cutting duct tape. Remember, you do have your three methods. You really have ripping the duct tape, which I guess doesn't quite qualify as cutting it, but it does work for, if you're just starting out. You do have your scissors, but always try to make sure it's a non-stick scissors. It'll save you a lot of hassle in the long run. And of course, probably the best method is using a hobby knife and a cutting mat, which of course you can get at your local craft store, and of course you can start with your ruler to help you, cut the straight lines and everything. So scissors, hobby knife, rulers, cutting mat, all found at local craft stores all over the place. And I hope you guys like this video on cutting duct tape in many different forms.